The small cafe was alive with the usual chatter of people. Some were seated at tables, sipping coffee or nibbling on pastries, while others were hurrying past the large windows that let in the afternoon sun. Outside, the streets were busy, cars honking softly, bicycles weaving through the traffic, and the occasional dog barking. It was the kind of place where people came and went without much notice, always in a rush or preoccupied with something. In the corner of the cafe, a piano sat quietly. Its polished wood gleamed softly under the warm light, but it was mostly ignored. Few people even glanced at it. For most, it was just part of the furniture, something to make the place look elegant rather than a source of music. She arrived quietly, carrying a small bag slung over her shoulder. She was not someone who drew attention. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied back in a low ponytail. Her face showed neither makeup nor a deliberate attempt to impress. She moved through the cafe calmly, pausing only for a moment to glance around before making her way to the piano. There was nothing dramatic about her entrance, nothing that would make anyone stop and stare. To most people, she was just another customer. But there was something about the way she walked. A quiet determination in her steps. It made her seem slightly different from the rest. She paused at the piano, resting her hand on the smooth surface. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a brief moment, as if she were greeting an old friend. The room continued as it had before, with the hum of conversation and the clatter of cups and plates. A few people noticed her sitting down, but no one paid much attention. A man at the counter muttered something under his breath about another amateur trying to show off, and a young woman at a nearby table rolled her eyes. The general sense in the room was that this would be nothing special. People had seen musicians try and fail. They had seen performers who never matched the expectation. And this piano player would probably be the same. She looked around once more, taking in the small audience that had accidentally gathered. There were maybe 15 people who had looked in her direction, more out of curiosity than interest. Some had phones ready to record a funny performance or an awkward failure. Others just sat, sipping their drinks, giving a polite glance before returning to their conversations. She did not notice them, or, if she did, she seemed unaffected. She was not here to impress, at least not in the way most people expected. Her eyes closed briefly, and she took a slow, deep breath. She let herself feel the weight of the day, the small pressures, the fatigue that came from ordinary life. This piano was not just an instrument. To her, it was a place to breathe, a place to speak without words. She placed her fingers gently on the keys. The first note she played was soft, almost hesitant. It did not demand attention. It was a small, simple sound that could have been ignored, but somehow it seemed to ask, very quietly, for the room to listen. Most people did not notice. The woman at the counter looked down at her phone. A child at a table giggled at something their parents said. Conversations continued. But there were a few who did hear, a few who paused mid-sentence and turned their heads, curiosity sparking. There was something in the note, something gentle yet unusual. It made people stop for a fraction of a second. She played a few more notes, each one simple and light. Her fingers moved with a delicacy that seemed almost accidental, but there was a clear control beneath it. There was an innocence in the way the notes were chosen, a purity that was hard to explain. It did not sound like a practiced, flashy performance. It sounded like someone speaking their mind through the piano, someone who had a story but was only beginning to tell it. The sound carried softly through the cafe, touching the edges of the room, brushing against the ears of those who were nearby. Some felt a tiny shiver. Others just looked up, mildly surprised. The man who had muttered under his breath before stopped talking. He straightened in his seat and listened, a frown on his face, as if trying to figure out why a simple note had caught his attention. The young woman with the phone lowered it, her eyes widening slightly. Even the child giggled once more, then tilted their head curiously, drawn to the unusual calm that seemed to seep from the piano. The cafe had not changed much in terms of energy, but something subtle had begun. There was a sense of curiosity in the air, a small shift. It was not applause or amazement yet. It was simply the recognition that something different was happening, something worth noticing. She continued to play, the notes forming a small, quiet melody. It was not fast or complicated, but it had movement, a flow that suggested thoughtfulness and care. Her hands seemed to glide over the keys, not rushing, not showing off, just allowing the music to emerge naturally. Each note felt deliberate, even if it seemed effortless. Her eyes stayed closed for most of the time, her head slightly tilted, her body relaxed yet focused. For her, it was not a performance to impress the crowd. It was a conversation with herself, with the piano, with the room. Whether the room realized it or not, as the melody continued, more people began to notice. A couple sitting near the window stopped talking and looked over. The barista behind the counter paused in washing a cup. Even the man who had been dismissive earlier now leaned slightly forward, his expression unreadable, trying to make sense of the music. There was no sudden fanfare, no dramatic gestures. Yet, little by little, the room started to respond, and it happened almost unconsciously. People began to listen, not because they had to, but because something inside them told them to. Her music was gentle, but purposeful. Each note seemed to carry a small piece of emotion, a tiny story fragment. It was not sad or happy in an obvious way, but it had depth, a feeling that resonated differently with each listener. Some felt calm, some felt a slight ache they could not name, and some just felt curiosity and wonder. The atmosphere in the cafe was changing. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but those who paid attention could feel it. The piano was no longer furniture. It was a voice, speaking softly yet meaningfully. She glanced at the small group who had gathered near the piano, noticing their quiet attention. There was a mix of surprise, curiosity, and skepticism. Some were clearly thinking, "This is better than I expected," while others were still unsure, waiting for something more to confirm that this was real. She did not play for them, not really. She played for herself, letting the music come naturally. But in doing so, she was drawing them in, almost like a magnet, without any effort or awareness. A few people whispered to each other. One said, "She's good, right?" And another nodded, unsure but intrigued. Phones that had been poised for recording earlier were now slowly lowered. People realizing that they were witnessing something unexpected. Not the grand finale, not a show, just the beginning, but it already carried weight. The quiet confidence of her playing made an impression that could not be faked. She paused for a moment. Resting her fingers lightly on the keys, the silence felt different this time. It was not awkward or empty. It was full, weighted with attention, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The few notes she had played had done something subtle, but undeniable. She opened her eyes slowly and scanned the small audience, noticing their expressions. There was interest, surprise, and even a hint of admiration. She smiled very slightly, a small, private acknowledgement that the music was working. Her message was reaching them. The cafe returned to its soft hum, but the music had left a mark. People had shifted in their seats, leaning in without realizing it. Conversations were quieter, glances more attentive. Even the barista, who had been busy cleaning, paused and tapped her fingers lightly against the counter, as if unconsciously keeping rhythm. It was clear now that something had started, something that no one could quite explain yet. The piano, silent for so long, had begun to speak, and the room had started to listen. She took another deep breath and prepared to play again. This time, her fingers would move with a little more confidence. The first notes had been an introduction, a gentle invitation, and now she was ready to speak more clearly. Not louder, not faster, but with a touch of depth and certainty. She wanted the music to grow, not in volume, but in presence, so to fill the space and touch the people fully. The room seemed ready, though they did not know it yet. A soft anticipation hung in the air, the kind that cannot be forced, but can only be felt. People adjusted their seating, leaning slightly forward, turning their heads. Even those who had doubted earlier were now watching with careful attention. Something was about to happen, something that would make them remember this ordinary afternoon as extraordinary. And with that, she pressed down on the keys once more. The notes rang out, clear and gentle, carrying a quiet promise. She was not trying to impress anyone, and yet, without realizing it, she had already begun to capture the hearts of those who were willing to listen. The cafe, full of ordinary moments and ordinary people, had already shifted. Something subtle but profound had begun. And it all started with one person, a piano, and a few soft, simple notes that no one had expected. The soft notes of her piano continued to float through the cafe, but now they were a little stronger, more deliberate, more purposeful. Each key pressed felt like a word spoken, quietly but clearly, like someone sharing a secret that only those who truly listened could understand. The people in the cafe began to notice more. Conversations that had been polite and scattered were slowing down. The hum of casual chatter faded into silence. Asher music began to take over, not forcefully, but naturally. Some people shifted in their seats. A man sitting near the window put down his newspaper, eyes fixed on the piano. A woman at a table in the middle of the cafe paused mid-sip, her hand frozen on her cup. Even the barista behind the counter stopped wiping down the counter and leaned slightly forward. Just a little, as if drawn by the sound. No one spoke. No one moved. The notes had become a thread connecting everyone, tying the small group together in a way they didn't fully understand yet. She did not rush. The first part of her music had been a gentle introduction, but now she allowed the melody to stretch, to breathe, to develop. The keys responded to her touch as if they knew what she wanted to say, resonating with warmth and clarity. Each note built upon the last, carrying a story that seemed to speak to something deep inside the listeners. It was not loud or dramatic, but there was a strength in it, a quiet confidence that made people sit straighter in their chairs. A couple who had just walked in paused near the door. The man's hand froze on the handle of the door, and the woman turned her head, curiosity overcoming her hesitation. They did not move to leave. Something in the music had stopped them in their tracks. It was strange, almost magical, how simple notes could hold attention so completely. They stepped further inside, glancing around to see who was playing. No one had yet recognized the quiet woman at the piano as someone extraordinary. But slowly, realization began to creep in. Her fingers moved faster now, but not hurriedly. There was a rhythm forming, a pulse that felt natural, almost like breathing. The music seemed to flow through her, not from her, as if she were merely a guide for something larger, something that existed beyond her, beyond the piano. Each note connected to the next, creating a chain of sound that carried a mixture of emotion, hope, longing, calm, and a hint of melancholy. The people listening could feel it even if they could not name it. It spoke to them in a language that did not need words. A young man near the back of the cafe shifted in his chair. He had been scrolling through his phone, bored and impatient, but now he placed it face down and leaned forward. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, unable to look away. He was not alone. Others, too, had stopped their activities. A mother holding a small child noticed her little one becoming unusually quiet, staring at the piano with wide eyes. Even the regulars, people who came to the cafe every day and thought they had seen everything, felt a flicker of surprise. Something was happening that they had not expected. The music began to change subtly. The first melody had been simple, almost like a gentle conversation, but now it began to deepen. She pressed the keys with a little more force, letting some notes linger longer than others. The harmony grew richer. There was a feeling of movement now, a story unfolding. People began to sense a shift, a little tension, a little release, a push and pull of sound that drew them in further. She was speaking without words, and the audience, whether they realized it or not, was listening. A few people exchanged glances. "Is she really that good?" whispered one quietly. "I didn't expect this," said another. There were no exaggerated reactions, no sudden gasps, just subtle acknowledgement. But it was enough. Enough to make everyone lean a little closer, sit a little straighter, pay a little more attention. The music had found its way past skepticism, past distraction, and into something much deeper, a place where people just had to stop and feel. She noticed them, but only slightly. Her eyes were mostly on the keys, and her mind was focused entirely on the music. She was not performing for applause or recognition. That was not her goal. She played because she had to, because the piano demanded it. because this was how she spoke her thoughts and emotions when words failed. And yet she could feel the presence of others, the way they leaned forward, the way they shifted in their seats, drawn by something intangible. She did not need to look to know they were listening. The melody grew more complex, but it never lost its sincerity. There were no flashy runs or showy gestures, no attempt to impress. The complexity came naturally, flowing from her understanding of the music and from her connection to it. It had layers, subtle shifts, little surprises that kept the listeners alert. Some notes were soft and tender, like whispers. Others were stronger, more insistent, like a call for attention. Together, they created a tapestry of sound that was mesmerizing. Even for those who had only been half interested at first, people began to stop in other parts of the cafe. A group at a table near the back had been laughing and chatting. But now they fell silent, turning toward the piano as if magnetized by the sound. The music did not demand silence, but it created it naturally. It was impossible to ignore. There was no reason for the entire cafe to be paying attention, yet somehow it was. Each person became aware of the others, the shared experience forming a quiet bond among strangers. She allowed herself a small smile. It was barely noticeable, but it was there, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection forming in the room. She was aware of the energy shifting, of the way her music was weaving its way into people's hearts without force. She felt a little thrill of satisfaction, not pride, but joy. The notes were doing their work, carrying emotion, telling a story, and she was merely the messenger. The woman's movements became more fluid, more confident. She could feel the story inside her taking shape. It was not rehearsed or planned, but it was growing naturally. She shifted her weight slightly, letting her body respond to the rhythm, the subtle sway of her arms adding expression to the sound. Each note was like a brushstroke, painting a picture that the listeners could only glimpse through their emotions, one by one. People began to react more visibly. A man who had been leaning against the counter now rested his chin on his hand, eyes fixed, completely absorbed. A young woman sitting near the piano wiped a small tear from her cheek, though she did it quickly, as if she did not want anyone to notice. A child, still clutching a stuffed animal, stared wide-eyed at the keys, mesmerized by the lights and the movement. Even the regulars, who thought they had seen it all, were caught off guard by the depth of feeling in the performance. She did not rush, and yet the music moved forward. The first hesitation, the soft introduction, was gone. There was purpose now, a clear direction. The melody curved and twisted, surprising at times, soothing at others. She allowed herself to become completely immersed, letting each note flow naturally. It was not about impressing anyone, not about showing skill or technique. It was about sharing something human, something honest. The audience, whether consciously or unconsciously, mirrored her attention. Breathing slowed. Eyes softened. People leaned forward, unconsciously mirroring the care and focus she gave to each note. The cafe, once a busy, noisy place, was now something different. It was quieter, warmer, charged with emotion. Music had transformed the ordinary afternoon into something extraordinary, something that would linger in memory long after the notes had stopped. Even the casual passerby outside the cafe windows paused for a moment, drawn to the faint sound of piano carrying through the doors. A delivery man stopped his bike for a moment, listening, then shook his head as if trying to convince himself he had imagined it. The music had reached beyond the walls, beyond the immediate audience. Touching anyone within earshot, she felt it all, but she remained calm. She did not smile broadly, did not raise her hands dramatically, did not seek attention. She simply played, letting the music guide her, letting it tell the story that only it could tell. She pressed each key with intention, allowing silence to fill the spaces between notes, letting the room breathe along with her. It was not loud or showy, but it was powerful in its subtlety. Time seemed to stretch. The minutes passed, unnoticed by anyone. People had forgotten about their phones, forgotten about the time, forgotten about their worries. The music had created a world inside the cafe where nothing else mattered. A temporary space where emotion flowed freely and attention was completely focused on sound and feeling. Strangers became witnesses to something fragile and yet profoundly moving, and still she did not finish. She let the music grow, letting the melody explore corners of emotion that words could never reach. Every note was deliberate yet free. Every pause was meaningful. She had captured something in herself, something she wanted to share. And now the room was listening. The cafe was no longer just a cafe. It had become a space of quiet wonder, of attention and feeling, of shared human experience. People were connected by the music, by the gentle power of a piano played with honesty and care. They did not know it yet, but this ordinary afternoon was turning into something memorable, something extraordinary. And it all started with one person, one instrument, and the courage to speak without words. The soft melody that had begun earlier was now growing, stretching and winding through the cafe with more confidence and purpose. Each note carried emotion in a way that was impossible to ignore. People had into the background, leaving the piano as the only voice in the room. Those listening could feel the difference. There was something more now, something that went beyond a simple tune. The music had begun to tell a story, one that no one could quite name. But everyone could feel. She did not rush, but her fingers moved with a newfound certainty. The melody shifted subtly, introducing more depth and layers. There were moments of quiet, almost hesitant notes, followed by stronger, more deliberate strikes. It was a dance of sound that mirrored human emotion, fragile, tentative, bold, and determined all at once. People leaned forward instinctively, as if their own bodies were responding to the rise and fall of the music. The cafe, filled moments ago with ordinary chatter, was now holding its collective breath. A few people exchanged looks of disbelief. "She's incredible," whispered one woman quietly to her friend, almost afraid that saying it louder would break the spell. Another nodded, unable to speak. The young man who had been scrolling on his phone in part two now had his elbows on the table, hands supporting his face, completely absorbed. He had thought he had seen musicians play before, but this was different. This was not a show, not a display of skill for attention. It was something real, something honest, something that reached inside him and tugged at a feeling he had not even realized was there. She noticed none of this. Or perhaps she noticed it in the smallest way. Her attention remained on the piano, on the flow of music, on the story she was telling through sound. Each note was chosen carefully, but not mechanically. It was a conversation between her and the instrument. And in that conversation, the room was included. Whether they were ready or not, people could feel the sincerity in the way her fingers pressed the keys. There was no rush, no artificial flair, no attempt to impress. It was pure, human, and profoundly moving. The music began to gain momentum. The melody shifted subtly, introducing harmonies that were both surprising and comforting. It was as though each note had its place in the story, and she was discovering it in real time. The notes danced lightly at times, then grew heavy and weighty, carrying emotion that seemed to resonate with the listeners in unexpected ways. A man who had been skeptical earlier now had his eyes closed, as if to absorb every nuance without distraction. A mother gently held her child closer, feeling the shift in the room. Sensing the quiet intensity of the music, even those who had only been mildly curious now found themselves drawn in completely. The cafe was no longer just a place to drink coffee or have lunch. It had become a theater, a space of shared emotion where strangers were united by something invisible yet tangible. The music was pulling them together, creating a quiet bond. A few people held their breath during certain moments, the music catching them off guard with its power, its subtle drama, and the beauty of its honesty. She allowed herself to move with the music slightly more, though still with restraint. Her body swayed gently in rhythm with her fingers, and each note seemed to carry a piece of her own story. She had not planned this performance, not in detail. She did not know exactly what she would play next. She only knew that the piano could speak the words her mind and heart could not. The room was responding naturally to her honesty. It was not amazement born of spectacle. It was recognition born of truth. The melody became more expressive. There were small flourishes, delicate movements that added texture without stealing attention. Each change in tempo, each pause, each emphasis carried meaning. The audience could feel it. Some faces reflected nostalgia, some surprise, some deep calm. A man who had been tapping his fingers impatiently on the table earlier now rested his hands, completely still, letting the sound move through him. Others had tears forming in their eyes, though they did not always notice them until a quiet moment revealed their emotion. People began to lean forward slightly, as if drawn closer by some invisible thread. They did not speak, did not clap prematurely. They were not waiting for an end. They were simply listening, completely absorbed. The cafe, once full of ordinary noise, had become a living, breathing entity, responding to each note as if it understood the story being told. The woman at the piano, unaware of the transformation she had caused, continued to play, weaving layers of melody with precision and care. The young man who had been skeptical before now whispered to himself, "I didn't think it could be like this." The mother beside him squeezed her child's hand gently, smiling softly at the small, unspoken connection forming in the room. Even the barista, who had been busy all day and was used to tuning out background noise, now paused with a cloth in her hand, feeling the music reach her in a way she had not expected. It was quiet but intense, gentle but profound. Each note seemed to touch a part of her that had been dormant. The piano sound grew even more intricate. There were moments of silence that were just as powerful as the notes themselves. She knew when to pause, when to let the space speak, when to allow the room to breathe. Each choice was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made a difference. The audience could feel the intention behind every motion, every press of a key. The music was alive, and the cafe was now fully immersed in it. Strangers were connected not through words but through shared emotion. Through the story unfolding before them, she pressed the keys with a careful intensity. The notes traveled through the room, reaching corners that had seemed impossible to touch. People moved slightly in their seats to follow the rhythm, unconsciously swaying with the melody. The child who had been quiet before now peeked around the edge of the mother's arm, eyes wide and sparkling, amazed at the power of something so simple and human. Even the regular customers, those who had been too familiar with the cafe to notice small changes, were captivated. The music demanded attention, not loudly, but irresistibly. The melody began to tell a story of longing. Each note carried a subtle ache, a soft sadness, but it was never heavy or overwhelming. It was gentle, touching the listener in ways that words could not. People felt memories rising within them, moments of their own lives surfacing quietly. A man, who had been lost in thought, closed his eyes and allowed a small smile to appear, remembering something that the music had brought back. A woman near the counter held her hands lightly in her lap, her eyes glistening with emotion she could not name. Her hands moved more fluidly now, but still with restraint. The story within her fingers continued to unfold. The music was no longer just a melody. It was a conversation between her and the audience, even if she did not speak or acknowledge them. She could feel their presence in the subtle ways they responded, slight nods, tiny shifts in posture, the soft exhale of someone realizing they were moved. She did not need to see them. The piano allowed her to connect quietly but profoundly. With everyone in the room, the audience became more aware of each other as the music grew. Strangers looked at one another, sharing the experience without words. There was no need for commentary, no need for approval. The music had created a silent understanding, a shared recognition of something special happening right here, right now. The cafe, a place that had once been ordinary and mundane, was alive with emotion. And it was all because of the honesty in her playing. She introduced small variations into the melody, little surprises that caught people off guard in a pleasant way. The music became playful at times, almost teasing, then shifted back to deep, reflective moments. This push and pull kept the audience attentive, even on edge with anticipation. They were experiencing something real, something human, something that could not be reproduced simply by skill alone. It was more than technique. It was soul. A man who had been quietly observing from the corner could no longer hide his amazement. His eyebrows were raised, and he shook his head slightly, muttering under his breath, "I didn't expect this." A woman near him whispered softly to her friend, It's like she's telling a story without words. They were all witnessing the power of music in its purest form. The tempo changed gently, creating tension and release. There were moments where the notes lingered, delicate and fragile, making listeners lean forward involuntarily. There were moments where the melody strengthened, bold and confident, making hearts race slightly with anticipation. She was guiding them, not commanding them, leading them through a journey they did not realize they were taking. And yet, the journey was beautiful, compelling, and impossible to ignore. Even the smallest details mattered. The subtle touch of her fingers, the way she allowed certain notes to ring longer than others. The careful silence between chords, all of it combined to create a profound sense of presence. Listeners could feel her concentration, her intention, her care. It was human, it was real, and it left them breathless, without them fully understanding why. Time seemed suspended. People were lost in the sound, fully immersed, their ordinary afternoon forgotten. The cafe had become a sanctuary of emotion, temporary escape where nothing else mattered except the music, the story it told, and the connection it created between them. The melody had become more than sound. It was life itself, fragile and beautiful, unfolding in real time. She did not need applause or recognition. She only needed the music to flow. And it did. With every note, the room became more alive, more aware, more connected. The ordinary had transformed into extraordinary. Hearts were moved. Minds were captivated. And slowly, subtly, disbelief began to turn into awe. The music had grown into something more than anyone had expected. The cafe, once just a simple place for coffee and conversation, had become a space alive with emotion. Each note she played seemed to stretch further, to reach deeper, touching people in ways they could not have anticipated. The melody carried power without shouting, grace without demanding, and truth without explanation. Every person in the room was caught, not by spectacle, but by honesty. By the quiet intensity that radiated from her fingertips. She leaned slightly forward. Her eyes still mostly closed, her fingers moving with a rhythm that seemed almost impossible to achieve naturally. The melody had grown in complexity but remained pure. It told a story of human life, of struggle, of patience, of quiet moments of triumph and sorrow. Listeners felt it in their own ways. Some were reminded of people they had lost, some of dreams they had set aside, and some of moments of joy they had almost forgotten. It was personal for everyone, yet shared collectively. People's breathing changed subtly as they listened. A man who had been slouched in his chair now sat upright, as though straightening his spine made him more capable of absorbing the music. A woman near the window held her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes shining as tears threatened to fall. The child sitting nearby, usually restless and fidgety, sat perfectly still, mesmerized by the piano and the grace with which it was being played. Even the barista, who had been used to ignoring background noise while working, paused and leaned against the counter, letting herself feel every note. The music became more layered. Soft, gentle notes danced lightly at first, then were followed by stronger chords that resonated with the room's walls, vibrating in a way that people could feel in their chests. There was a pulse, a heartbeat that connected everyone. Each note seemed deliberate, perfectly placed, yet effortlessly played. The rhythm changed without warning, keeping listeners alert, making their hearts beat in sync with the piano. It was a connection that no one could have anticipated when she had first walked in and sat at the instrument. Few people exchanged quiet glances, unable to speak because the music demanded their full attention. One whispered, "I can't believe this. She's extraordinary." Another nodded slowly, as if agreeing with an unspoken truth. No one laughed, no one moved impatiently, no one checked their phones. They were all suspended in time, fully present, completely caught in the web the music had created. The cafe was alive in a new way, one of shared human experience. Subtle but profound, she allowed her fingers to glide over the keys with increasing freedom. The melody began to rise, layering emotion upon emotion. Moments of soft tenderness alternated with chords that carried power and strength. The story of the music unfolded naturally, almost as if it had existed long before she had ever touched the piano. She was not creating it as much as guiding it, revealing it, letting it speak in a language that needed no translation. The audience could feel it. Their hearts followed each note, their minds carried by the rhythm. Their emotions touched in ways that were delicate and profound. A man who had been skeptical earlier could no longer hide his astonishment. His hands rested on the table, trembling slightly as he realized that this was more than a casual performance. It was intimate. It was real. It was alive. The music continued to evolve. It began to fill every corner of the cafe, reaching even the smallest, quietest spaces. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of papers. Even the distant sounds from outside seemed to be absorbed and carried along by the piano's voice. The room was completely transformed. Strangers who had been indifferent minutes ago were now fully invested. Some had tears sliding down their cheeks. Some smiled softly, and some simply sat, eyes wide, feeling something profound that they could not fully articulate. The melody became more dramatic without ever becoming harsh. There were moments where her fingers struck the keys with clear intensity, creating waves of sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor and walls. Then she would soften, letting a delicate chord linger in the air, giving listeners a moment to breathe, to absorb, to feel. The push and pull of the music mirrored human life itself, moments of strength and moments of vulnerability. Moments of silence and moments of voice. People began to lean forward slightly, as if drawn in by invisible threads. A woman who had been scrolling on her phone moments ago now sat upright, her hands folded neatly on the table, completely absorbed. A couple near the corner had stopped talking entirely, faces turned toward the piano, eyes reflecting the quiet awe they felt. Even the child, who had been silent for much of the afternoon, was leaning slightly forward, lips parted, captivated by the subtle rise and fall of each note. She allowed the music to swell. It was not loud, but it was full, carrying a weight of feeling that made people sit straighter, hold their breath, and let themselves be taken away. There was a tension in the room, a quiet anticipation, as if everyone was holding on to the music, not wanting to lose a single note. And yet there was no sense of pressure or performance. It was natural, flowing, honest, as though the piano itself were alive and speaking directly to everyone present. Some listeners felt chills run down their spines. Some felt warmth in their hearts. Some felt a pang of sadness that they could not explain. Each note was designed not just to be heard, but to be felt, to create connection and stir emotion. She had not intended to affect anyone in particular, and yet she could sense the impact. The cafe, which had been full of ordinary conversations and movement, was now unified in silent attention. Each person touched in their own way. The music became more playful at times, introducing light, delicate sequences that danced over the room like sunlight flickering through leaves. Then, unexpectedly, it would return to deep, resonant chords, grounding everyone again, reminding them of the weight of the emotions being shared. This balance between strength and subtlety kept everyone engaged, alert, and emotionally involved. The audience was not passive. They were participants in something larger than themselves. Without realizing it, united by the sound and honesty of the piano, she did not look around much, but she could sense the change in the room. There was an energy now, a shared awareness, a quiet acknowledgement that what was happening was rare and special. People had stopped fidgeting, stopped worrying about time, stopped noticing anything except the flow of sound and the emotions it stirred. She was not performing for applause or recognition. Yet she could feel the connection forming, strong and undeniable. The intensity continued to build gradually. The melody was no longer just beautiful, it was commanding, drawing listeners fully into its rhythm and emotion. Her hands moved with fluid precision, yet there was no artificiality. Each note was alive, deliberate, carrying feeling that no words could convey. The room was fully transformed. What had started as an ordinary afternoon, a regular cafe with Ornan, ARY people, had become a shared human experience, fragile, intimate, and unforgettable. Even those who had doubted her at first could not ignore the power of the music. The man who had whispered his disbelief now looked around in quiet awe. The young woman who had been scrolling on her phone sat frozen, completely immersed. A few others had tears glimmering in their eyes, though they did not dare wipe them away, not wanting to break the moment. There was a sense of wonder in the room, a silent reverence for what they were witnessing, and it was all because of the honesty, the depth. In the soul in her music, she introduced subtle changes in tempo and rhythm now, guiding the melody toward peaks and valleys of emotion. There was a sense of journey, a narrative hidden in the music. Every person listening was on this journey with her, whether they wanted to be or not. The notes became bridges, connecting hearts, minds, and emotions, making the cafe feel like a single living organism, all breathing and moving together in response to her piano. The crescendo came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then more clearly. The music swelled, filling the room with resonance and depth. People could feel it in their chests, in their stomachs, in the quiet ache of their hearts. It was not dramatic in a theatrical sense, but it was profound in a human way. The melody carried triumph, reflection, longing, and hope simultaneously, weaving an experience that was personal yet universal. And then, as the final notes approached, she softened the melody, allowing each chord to linger, each pause to resonate, giving the audience space to breathe and absorb everything they had just experienced. The room was silent, the kind of silence that comes after something deeply moving. It was not awkward. It was not forced. It was filled with awe, respect, and reflection. Each listener sat quietly, processing what they had just felt, aware that they had witnessed something rare and beautiful. The cafe had been transformed. What had begun as ordinary moments of passing through a space had become an extraordinary, shared human experience. Strangers had been connected through emotion, through melody, through the honesty of her playing. She had turned the room upside down, not with spectacle,